I'd like to welcome everybody to this event on relocation to safer ground. This event is being put forward by Columbia's Adaptation Initiative, an Earth Institute effort centered as much as anything around increasing collaboration across Columbia, recognizing that adaptation to climate change, preparing for those shifts in climate that we're already locked into and that we anticipate, is an issue and is a challenge that goes far beyond climate science and the hazards of things like sea level rise. So, with that in mind, the Earth Institute has put together a 3-year cross-cutting initiative that's aiming to really stake a claim at Columbia around solutions to the climate change problem, and specifically adaptation. We've put together, through that initiative, a diverse group. We bring in perspectives from history departments, social science, public policy, earth science, you name it. And our event today, I think, is going to speak to one of the most hottest, really, topics around climate adaptation. The work that we've been doing over our first year, as we now begin our second of 3 years, has been around identifying key research themes where there's potential for rapid advancement in our understanding, but also where there's extreme societal needs, sort of finding that interface between where there's room for advances in understanding and a real societal need. One obvious area that fits that bill, and one of our 3 themes, is urban adaptation, contrasting, for example, what cities like New York City that may be relatively far along in their adaptation planning have done, what's been successful, but also what are the implications and what's the kind of situation in some cities around the world that maybe aren't as far along in adaptation, don't necessarily have the resources. That's one of our themes. A second theme has to do with the conservation development interface. As we look around the world, specifically at least developed countries, as we think about key conservation issues and human development, what role can adaptation play in advancing solutions that work for people and for ecosystems? Our third theme, which has some overlap with those two, is what we're here to talk about today. Retreat, relocation, there's a lot of terms that have been put forward for it. As a climate scientist, I can tell you that we're already seeing vulnerabilities to extreme weather events increase. If we think about some of the events that we've had during the last year, Hurricane Harvey with the extreme rainfall in the Houston area, the devastating effects of Maria recently in Puerto Rico, wildfires that we've seen in Northern California, all have a component that's influenced by a changing climate, whether it's heavier rainfall, whether it's drier soils leading to more fires in the California case. As sea levels rise, as average temperatures go up, we're going to see more of these types of extreme events. We're going to see more area inundated, which makes this discussion all the more timely. But we're not primarily going to talk about climate science today. What we have here is a distinguished panel of Columbia experts who think about societal vulnerability to climate extremes and who are thinking about solutions, what we can do in the face of these climate changes. And today we're going to specifically talk about this issue of retreat. So here to help navigate us through this discussion, which is going to run an hour, we'll have 45 minutes of structured conversation that I'll lead, but then we're going to have time, at least 15 minutes for questions from you all. Afterwards, we'll have a reception. As some of you have noticed, there'll be a chance to talk to some of the panelists, some of us afterward. But to help us through the discussion now, I'd like to welcome Lisa Dale, Alex Sherbinin, and Mike Gerrard. And I'll briefly say a little about each of them. So Lisa Dale just recently joined the Earth Institute. She's a lecturer in the undergraduate program in sustainable development with an E3B appointment. That's ecology, evolution, and environmental biology. She's got a fascinating background. She's worked in various federal projects. She's been employed by the state of Colorado on a lot of their adaptation issues. She also has extensive experience teaching, for example, at Colorado State, at University of Denver. So she's worked at the academic sort of practitioner interface, and I think will bring a really interesting perspective to our discussion. Alex Sherbinin is the Associate Director for Science Applications at the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, which all of us know as CESN. Alex is a geographer whose research interests focus on the human aspects of global environmental change and geospatial data applications, integration, and dissemination. Finally, last but certainly not least, we have Michael Gerrard, the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia's Law School, Director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, also the Chair of the Faculty of Columbia University's Earth Institute. He practiced environmental law for decades in New York, more recently joined Columbia several years ago. I won't go through all the awards that he's received because I want to get us to our discussion. So I think I'll kick things off if I could, just giving you each of you a chance to say a little bit about, why from your perspective do we need to be having this conversation about retreat and relocation? What aspects of the question interest you, concern you, or where do you see, sort of given your background, an area that you can contribute? What does this problem mean to you?
Well, as the only lawyer on the panel, and knowing that lawyers are universally and deservedly beloved, I'm going to give a lawyer's answer, which is that a major issue that I think about when looking at retreat is property rights. The United States Constitution enshrines property rights as a right. It does not enshrine environmental rights. When we are talking about retreat, whether managed or not, we're saying to people, this particular property can't be utilized, can't be occupied. And that massively decreases its value, possibly to zero, and leads to claims by the owner or whoever it is whose property has been devalued that they want to be compensated for it. That becomes a massive impediment to retreat. There are, under some circumstances, no compensation would be required, but under others it would be required. This is a similar phenomenon to why it is so difficult to rationalize the flood mapping system, that designating a particular parcel of land as within a floodplain lowers its property values and therefore leads to massive political opposition. So this is one of the many problems we need to tackle in order to successfully deal with a managed retreat issue. What do we have to compensate for? To the extent we do have to compensate for it, who pays for it? And how do we value it? And leaving aside the issues that we'll talk about in a few minutes, which is retreat to where?
Thanks. So I come to this topic with a bit of an American West lens and a particular focus on wildfire. So it's a bit different than sea level rise, but certainly is in the news quite a bit, including today, where we heard about another fire in Southern California. So the wildfire issue, when we think about that in the context of climate change adaptation, there are many similarities. I think we'll get to some of the differences and similarities. But I want to take a couple of minutes to sort of set the stage, because it's maybe less well understood here on the East Coast than perhaps the coastal issues have become. So across the American West, what we call the wildland-urban interface, or affectionately called the WUI, worst possible acronym, is the riskiest area for new development and existing development. It's the place where private land abuts public land or forested vegetation at risk for fire. The growth of homes and development in the WUI, in the wildland-urban interface, continues to grow, and the cost of wildfire also continues to grow. The fires are starting earlier, ending later. Here it is December. They cost more, they cause more damage, they burn more intensely and cause longer lasting damage. And so people always ask, well, why do people want to live there? Why would you live in a high-risk fire zone? And that's where I think we come to the retreat and resettlement question, and we can get to some of the details around that. I do want to point out that I think unlike the coastal flooding issue, the wildfire issue is very wrapped up in ownership boundaries. We have public land and private land, federally managed public land that abuts private property. And so just going right off Dr. Gerrard's remarks, certainly the ownership of private property is essential for understanding the wildfire problem.
So, as Radley indicated in the introduction, I'm a geographer, perhaps widely loved, but probably also widely misunderstood. A lot of people say I'm a geologist, or they think I just study rocks, so that's not what I do. What kind of captivated me about geography was, as an undergrad, was basically the human-environment interface and how humans interact with the environment and how the environment in turn impinges on human activities. And so as I got more and more deeply into the issues around climate change, I sought to employ my, spatial understanding and spatial tool set to look at issues around climate vulnerability mapping, hotspots mapping, things of that sort. And that kind of led me on another rabbit trail of, well, what if certain areas might become increasingly uninhabitable? What if certain agricultural regions that currently support maybe sparse populations but still support, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Sahel, so that you could think the Sahel, small rural agriculturalists, farmers, pastoralists, mixed in. What if those areas become increasingly at risk from climate impacts, and where do those people go then, and what kind of livelihoods do they develop in order to kind of adapt to those situations? So it's sort of out of climate hotspots mapping that I began to look at two different issues. One is, voluntary migration, and then the other is situations where people may be so poor, what they call now trapped populations, for lack of maybe a better or more elegant term, but these are populations that lack the wherewithal to move on their own, might require assistance with resettlement. So we can return to that maybe a little later.
Yeah, that would be great. So, what we're talking about here essentially, I think fundamentally, is places on the earth where it's going to be too costly potentially to try to stay in place, whether it's in the face of sea level rise and inundation, higher temperatures and humidity, agricultural insecurity. So we're going to be putting forward arguments, partly based on risk, but there are going to be other elements as well, arguing for removing ourselves from harm's way. So the first question I'd like to pose is, can we find some precedents? Are there places around the world where we have seen people retreat, whether voluntarily or maybe forcibly, if that's the right term for it, in the face of climate hazards? Can you tell us a little bit about historical or maybe present context? Can I turn to you, Mike, for a little insight on that?
Well, in the United States, there have been very few instances of it. After Sandy, there was a voluntary buyout program that was successful for a small part of Staten Island, where people were bought out, but at enormous cost, and that's part of the problem. That at scale, if we're talking about millions of people having to be on the move, it just doesn't work. There have been some programs in parts of the United States after mostly river flooding in the Midwest, where there has been a successful relocation, but not really on a mass scale. Lisa, do you want to tell us?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that there's very little scholarship on this dimension of the wildfire problem. There's one case study that was done after the 4 Mile Canyon fire in Colorado in 2010. It was a fire that destroyed 169 homes and burned 6,000 acres. And as it turns out, only 4% of residents in that area reported wanting to move after the fire. So what we see in wildfire, I think, is somewhat consistent with what we see in sea level rise and in coastal communities, which is people get evacuated, so that's a forced retreat in the face of a disaster, and then for the most part they choose to come back. And we can talk about some of the reasons and incentives that are built in for that.
So in terms of precedents, scholars have been looking at a number of different historical events where voluntary migration was a response to climate pressures. So going back to the breakup of the Roman Empire, there was a period called the Great Migration period. I'm not a historian. There's been papers written on this. I think what they've been able to determine is there were climate anomalies, partly due to paleoclimatic records and things. Obviously, people weren't collecting precipitation records and measuring the temperature back then in the way we do today, but there's ways you can reconstruct the climate during that period. Moving forward a little in history, I think there were some waves of the, recently there was a paper saying Southeast Germany suffered some climate setbacks and shocks in the 19th century that led to a large migration out of Southeast Germany. The Irish potato famine was an unusual period of wet weather that maybe was beneficial to the fungus or whatever that devoured the potatoes that the Irish population depended on. And of course, we benefited from that here in New York greatly through the Irish, Great Migration. The Dust Bowl, another instance of voluntary migration in response to climate impacts, but also land mismanagement. So there go the point that none of these things are, in isolation. People don't just pick up and move because suddenly it gets hotter or drier necessarily, but there's a confluence of factors that may push them out. And more recently, the Sahelian drought. I mentioned the Sahel earlier, but there were a lot of displacements to urban areas, and I was actually there for the second wave of that drought, which occurred in the early 80s, and saw a lot of dead cattle and a lot of desiccated fields, and people essentially, where they could, move to larger cities, Dakar, Bamako, and N'Djamena, things like that, and settled in what they called bidonvilles, which are large, informal settlements on the outskirts. So that's, voluntary, and then there are more recent examples of planned resettlement that, if you like, I could discuss a little bit later in terms of what we've learned from that thus far.
Yeah, I think a recent research article suggested roughly 1 million people have been evacuated or have retreated in various contexts in recent decades. Arguably a very small number globally compared to the current risks and future risks. It's been estimated that 2 million or more people in the U.S. alone are going to be living in regions that are going to be essentially inundated by sea level rise this century. So I think, from here, let's talk a little bit, Mike, if I could ask you to lay out the landscape for us a little more around some of the legal strategies that could be applied or key legal questions as we think about approaches to retreat, maybe first in the U.S., and then if there are some different insights internationally, maybe you could weigh in a little bit on that too.
So in the U.S., there's not really a structure that is set up to do that at all. There are certainly land use controls that could be imposed by government to say that people can't live in a particular place, but it comes down to the takings issue, the property rights issue that I mentioned. And whenever the federal government tries to regulate land use, it is massively opposed, and generally Congress will step in and say don't. The Congress did provide the support for the Sandy recovery, and New York chose to use a chunk of it for that, but there wasn't a legal requirement. On an international basis, the situation is even tougher. If we're talking about cross-border migration, there is no international law that compels a country to take in people from other countries. It's wholly voluntary. We saw, a couple years ago with the people fleeing Syria and Eritrea and crossing the Mediterranean, the massive political crisis that erupted in Europe on where all these people should go. No country is obligated to take in people from other countries. There are a number of sort of voluntary guidelines that have been promulgated, some from the UN, more from NGOs and academic communities and so forth, but they're not binding on everybody, on anybody. There has been negotiation under the aegis of the UN of a global compact on migration. A few days ago, Rex Tillerson announced that the U.S. was pulling out of it because it was a threat to U.S. sovereignty. It was the furthest thing from that. It was wholly voluntary, but the current U.S. government has such a anti-immigrant fervor that it's hard to imagine the U.S. in the short term agreeing to take in people. So it's really a matter of trying to find sufficient humanity in national governments to agree voluntarily to take people in, and sometimes we see that, and more often we don't.
Thanks. So as we think a little more about, who should decide when retreat makes sense and when retreat should happen. Maybe hear a little from you, Alex and Lisa, about what you think the prospects are for getting people to retreat pre-disaster, different mechanisms that could be employed. Are there levers that, whether it's insurance or other incentives that could help maybe accelerate some of these processes before a disaster happens as well? I'd love to hear your thoughts on those topics, either of you.
So, it's really hard to convince people to do something until disaster strikes. So, a good example is a case of planned resettlement, or at least anticipated resettlement. The community in Newtok, Alaska, wishes to resettle. They've had steady coastal erosion as a result of permafrost loss. So the land that was formerly frozen when major Arctic storms would blow up against their shore is no longer frozen. It's a very small community. I think it's maybe under 200, maybe even as small as 100 plus people, and yet the U.S. government basically does not have a mechanism in terms of policy for relocating people in anticipation of a major disaster. So, for instance, FEMA funding is all contingent on a disaster having happened. So we're starting to get a little smarter about these things. There's a community in Louisiana called St. Charles, and they're also indigenous, partially indigenous at least. They plan to relocate, and the state has now gotten behind them, and I gather there's something like $40 million in funds available to move them. Now the question will be, is that really enough to reconstitute livelihoods? It's not just, rebuilding homes is one thing, but also rebuilding communities and kind of allowing the former structures and the tissue of the community to reform. And those are kinds of things that generally require some funds to facilitate. So I'll stop there, but I think the basic question of whether we're going to get ahead of the curve is really an important one. One thing I will do is I'll just bring in some experience from China, where they have something called ecological migration. So that program basically has resettled large numbers of people. I mean, we're talking millions of people now from rural communities in the margins of Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, Gansu province, and some other areas, in part because the Chinese government wants to reduce the number of people working lands and cultivating and grazing in areas that are sources of dust storms for Beijing. So they want to stop this dust from coming to Beijing, and one way to do that is to get people off the land and plant lots of trees. And if you do that, then hopefully it solves part of the dust problem. But also, they didn't want to continue to support these small rural communities with postal services and schools and all that expensive infrastructure, when basically it was not cost effective to do that anymore. So they were moving them into oasis communities. I think the New York Times has reported on some of this. It's a mixed bag. I heard from a colleague who was a postdoc at Columbia that his family had to pay something like $20,000 to move themselves. So they got some government support, but they also had to partially pay. And $20,000 for a Chinese peasant is an awful lot of money. So we're talking about a program that is pretty heavy-handed and top-down, but it is what you would say in anticipation of worse, perhaps, droughts or other ecological or disaster events in the future. So.
And when it comes to wildfire, there's very little talk of resettlement or retreat in the context of wildfire. Instead, a lot of the effort, the public effort, the government effort, and the nonprofit effort is going toward improving resilience and reducing the risk from fire. So there's a lot of work to make communities fire-wise. And a lot of the language around doing that reflects the reality of these communities living within a fire-adapted ecosystem, where the fire is not only guaranteed, but is in fact necessary for the health of the ecosystem. And the challenge facing homeowners in that area is how to keep themselves safe in the inevitable face of fire. I will say a couple of words about insurance because that's been a hot topic, no pun intended. How do we think about the role of insurance in wildfire? The first myth is people assume when they see these fires on TV and they seem so catastrophic that it must be costing the home insurance industry a terrible amount of money. And in fact, it isn't. It's a fraction of the costs that the insurance company bears from hail or water damage. In the period of 1995 to 2014, only 1.5% of insured losses had to do with fire, and that includes structural fire, not wildfire. So it's really not yet impacting the bottom line enough to drive the insurance industry to fundamentally change the way they insure homes in the wildland-urban interface. Furthermore, when rates have gone up slightly, and some insurance companies have jacked rates up in different locations at different times, the research shows that it has very little effect on people's decisions to stay or to leave or to remain in that home or to buy the home in the first place. So insurance doesn't seem to be a driving factor in people's choice about where to be. It does seem to have some effects on their behavior, on building materials and reducing flammable materials around the home and doing all the associated work that we think is part of reducing risk. Some insurance companies now require policyholders to do a certain amount of work on their property in order to qualify for a policy or to get reduced rates on the policy. So we do see insurance having an impact on those types of behaviors, but not in the resettlement area.
Can I say a couple words about insurance to follow from what Lisa said? So the way the National Flood Insurance Program works is that FEMA maps certain areas as being high flood hazard. And if the municipality where this occurs takes certain zoning and building code actions that reduce the flood risk, then people who live there can buy federally subsidized flood insurance. The flood insurance that is provided costs far less than the market. And every time there is a big hurricane, the flood insurance program runs up a multi-billion-dollar deficit, which Congress needs to fill in or not. Meanwhile, the flood mapping is done entirely based on the past rather than the future. It looks at what would have been the past floods as opposed to what are the anticipated future floods. And so the areas that are mapped as flood hazard areas are grossly under-inclusive. Congress directed FEMA a few years ago to try to fix that. It's been taking a very long time, and they're nowhere near that. Congress a few years ago also enacted a law to have the flood insurance rates rise closer to what the market would be, what a true risk-based cost would be. As that was about to happen, as the flood rates were about to actually go up, as the law provided, there was such a public outcry that that was repealed. And so there so far has been no willingness to have insurance reflect the actual risk. It ought to. The insurance companies are in the risk business, and they can understand very rationally what a risk would be and price accordingly. And if that were to happen, that would drive a whole lot of movement away from hazardous areas. But we have this perverse flood insurance program that subsidizes continued development in risky areas.
Yeah. Maybe shifting gears a little bit, do you see any prospects for maybe recasting this discussion around the context of retreat to where? Is there any hope to sort of present this as not just a total loss, having to leave the places we know, having to abandon these assets, but is there any potential to have a coherent way of thinking about opportunities in new places? Or even more generally, just having criteria for how we define the best places for people to go to. What should we be thinking about? Should we be aiming for a few large centers? Is this going to be a more dispersed process? What should we be thinking about as we ask where these people are going to be moving to? Anybody?
So we at Season recently completed a project. We're working with the World Bank to do some modeling on climate-induced migration based on 3 different kind of climate impacts: crop production declines, water availability declines, and also sea level rise and storm surge. And part of the purpose in the modeling was to anticipate. We looked at 3 regions in depth: Central America and Mexico, East Africa, and South Asia. And it was partly to anticipate what the spatial patterns, so we do a lot of spatial modeling, and so we wanted to see where people might move and what that was. One of the policy conclusions of the report, which is not out yet, it'll be out in January or February, was basically that we really should see migration, and especially voluntary migration, as a useful adaptation strategy, and governments need to do more to support migration, particularly where rural livelihoods will become increasingly imperiled and urban or other peri-urban or agricultural processing or other value-add kind of things might be more profitable and also kind of lift people out of poverty. What you want to avoid in all cases is a situation where people leave because of what we call distress migration. Essentially, people leave with just the shirts on their backs or their few belongings. They've been hammered so many times by climate shocks that they've essentially lost most of their household assets, whether it's cattle or their houses may be destroyed or whatnot from floods. You want to try to anticipate as much as possible, but it's a really tricky issue, and I don't know if we're going to succeed in getting ahead of the curve on some of these things, especially at the scale that it needs to be done.
Can I address that on a domestic level? I mean, it's easy enough to theorize what would be the ideal places for people to go, what would be the characteristics of alternative places. Translating that into actual places is a whole lot harder. If you want something with a lot of acreage and a water supply, and ideally where you can grow some crops and so forth, there are very few places that aren't already occupied by something, or in use for agricultural or grazing or other kinds of activities, or preserved from development. If there were, there'd probably be shopping centers there or something like that. So there's a lot of demand for land, and the land is either privately owned or publicly owned. If it's publicly owned, it's often protected in some ways. If it's privately owned, the owners want to be paid a lot of money for it. And so finding locations to build new settlements is very challenging. I think the much more promising scenario for at least some people would be to go to those cities that have lost populations, places like Detroit, that have a pretty large unoccupied building stock. Obviously, it's not all in great shape, and you have to come up with livelihoods for everyone, but at least those are places that exist, and you don't have to be displacing farmland and so forth. I think that domestically there may be much more potential in that kind of thing.
Yeah. Imagine also you wouldn't have to burn as many fossil fuels in new home construction.
And you have the density where you can have mass transit.
Right.
I think one key thing here is having enough density so that you can have mass transit, you can have a reasonable amount of energy efficiency in the buildings, so you're not consuming a lot of land. I think that that vertical development is going to be very important as one element to this going forward. Not send everybody out to sprawling single-family ranch homes.
Right. So maybe let's pursue a little further some of the economics of retreat. As you alluded to some of these issues, especially Michael, the enormous amount of stranded assets potentially. You can argue that we're in a situation here where the markets haven't yet priced what's inevitable, at least in some of these parts. If we think of South Florida, for example, where there's just no situation where you could come up with any kind of structure that can hold back the water, right? South Florida is the iconic example because you basically have a limestone underneath, essentially a Swiss cheese. Even if you were to build a seawall, the water's just going to percolate up from underneath. So that's sort of a metaphor for this more generic risk that any place that doesn't have a ton of money or doesn't accept the climate science, or doesn't have the capacity to make these kind of changes may face. So can you see the economics shifting? Can you see any mechanisms arising whereby you could find ways to fund some of the retreat. Maybe not everywhere, but if you were to identify some most at-risk regions, whether from a climate perspective or a human vulnerability perspective, tell us a little bit about some creative funding mechanisms that might not get us all the way there, but could get us part of the way there.
I can speak a little bit to the economics of fire suppression and how that weighs into the management of wildfire in the American West. Much like the flood planning, the way the federal fire budget is structured is backward-looking, not forward-looking. So the U.S. Forest Service, which is the main firefighting agency for wildland fire in the West, budgets annually based on the last 10 years of fire costs. And so they're always estimating too low. And the cost now of suppressing fires has grown from 16% of the U.S. Forest Service budget in 1995 to more than 50% of the budget today. And where does that money come from? It comes out of other line items in the Forest Service budget, including efforts that might, at least in theory, reduce the risk of fire in the future. So the fuels reduction activities, the work that is done on public lands to reduce risk of fire, those funds get stripped to fight fire. So we're a little bit stuck in the wildfire community in figuring out a way out of that. There are always proposals on the table, including handing over firefighting to FEMA, including handing over firefighting to a newly created agency that would just handle it that way. But for now, the economics are a significant part of the ongoing problem.
I mean, in the ideal world, you would probably finance a chunk of this through a price on carbon. A lot of this displacement is a negative externality of the burning of fossil fuels. And so if you were to build that into the price and pay for some of this through a price on carbon, you could generate a whole lot of money that way. Obviously, that would require congressional action. And this Congress thinks that it's much better to spend massive amounts of money on preserving the estate tax and lowering the corporate tax rate. So we're not going to see this anytime soon, but if you're thinking about what would be an ideal solution, I think internalizing the externalities of fossil fuel use would be a way that a great deal of money could be generated at the same time that you're creating a major economic incentive to move away from fossil fuels, because the cost of it begins to reflect its actual external cost.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little. Let's maybe wrap up some of this discussion now. I mean, one aspect that I think we're hearing is that there is potentially a huge bubble here. On the one hand, it's hard to predict when some of these property values, might fall, but it's probably sooner than most people think. We can imagine situations where if the property values drop dramatically, you no longer have the ability to fund key public infrastructure, for example. I'm wondering if you could actually see a scenario where people start to move quickly in terms of retreat, maybe even in some places before they actually experience the flooding, if the prices start to drop, if there's that sort of societal tipping point. And for example, after such a point, if a government started to offer buyouts at full cost, at near current values of property, could you imagine a point where people actually started to jump at that? Maybe especially if the funds available weren't large enough to pay for everybody's assets as they moved. Of course, there'd be all sorts of issues related to fairness, who had access to that information, who jumped first, who got left behind, who didn't have the capacity to move. But I guess the question is just sort of generally about whether you see any potential tipping points here, any way. Is part of the reason we're not seeing government doing more about this because of this fear of the bubble, and what can we do to sort of tackle that problem in a fair way? Anybody?
Well, of course, a major constraint is a lot of people have mortgages.
Yeah.
And if you're fleeing your property, you can't pay off your mortgage, and it may be that all that happens to the house is that the house gets foreclosed and the banks go bankrupt. But meanwhile, some of your assets were all tied up in the house, and you don't have enough money left to buy a new house or even to rent a new house. And of course, the people who were renting, barely have assets at all. So you would, theoretically, you could have a massive governmentally financed bailout, so at least you are providing alternative housing in other locations. I have a feeling it would be sort of cheap housing, but even with that, if you add up the numbers that we're talking about, it becomes a frightfully large number.
I mean, one financial disincentive to governments, essentially declaring areas as retreat zones is that you suddenly lose tax revenue. And so you're in a situation where you're essentially going to have to lay out a lot of funds to potentially to relocate people, to tear down houses, to you name it. And on top of that, you're losing the tax revenue to fund it. So I think it's one strong reason why we've seen, if anything, more of an impetus to build up and grow in these vulnerable coastal zones than to actually discourage development or rezone and suggest that developers go elsewhere.
Well, I think, we're now about 15 minutes from the end. I think this has been great comments so far. I'd really like to give the audience a chance to jump in. I think we have mics. Why don't we start passing those around? Start over there.
Thank you. Could you talk about the strains on political philosophy in our country that this kind of threat would induce? Because I think about Rockaway. Rockaway, half the public housing in Queens is in Rockaway. Lots of poor black and Hispanic Americans. Where are they going to relocate to, given the kind of robber baron mentality we have in the country right now? The sort of Gilded Age political philosophy we have as what we see right now with the tax reform debate. Those people don't care about people like that. So can you share with us, what do you think can happen? How are we going to have to change?
Comments?
I mean, we're in an era where facts and reality don't matter much anymore. The facts of economics, the universally understood facts, obviously not universally, but widely understood facts that tax cuts don't pay for themselves, that the climate is changing, that people have a lot to do with it. All these facts out there that people are ignoring, and I'm looking forward to the bourbon.
Let's go over here. And maybe wait for the mic if you could. Comment over here.
I have to say I feel badly about that answer, but I wish there was something I could tell you.
I think that so I believe it was Mr. Sherbinin who raised a very interesting point, dissecting different types of climate migrants. The UN puts out reports saying that there's up to tens or up to hundreds of millions of projected climate refugees in the future. Do you think that it's a realistic number, or do you think it's perhaps inflated and not all of them are distress migrants like you were explaining?
Well, not every person who migrates largely because, or in part because, climate impacts have made their lives less agreeable where they are in their source areas are necessarily distress migrants. So I think it's going to be a perennial issue. People want a number. The bank wanted a number. Once we ran the migration model, I was going to be content with maps, and now they wanted a number. So we had to come up with numbers for them. And I won't go into the boring details of how we did that, but yeah, they were in the range for just three regions, the regions I mentioned, of 52 to about 100 million people. But these are internal migrants, so we're not talking about people crossing borders. There are a bunch of caveats to the numbers that we generated. And you literally, according to the modeling exercise, you had to move at least 15 kilometers or more because that's the size of the grid cells that we employed. So it wasn't, it's not super elegant as far as a number goes. But I think that the one issue that we're going to, people want the numbers, but people don't walk around with big badges saying I'm a climate migrant. I think there will be, if those who argue that we should change the Refugee Convention or otherwise broaden the definition of refugees legally to include those who are displaced because of climate impacts, which is on the table, but I think it's not going to go very far. We can't agree on a global compact on voluntary migration. The UN HCR is already overburdened by existing, the refugee system internationally is overburdened by those who are leaving countries out of well-founded fears of persecution, etc. So expanding it to include climate migrants is very unlikely. But I think that what's apparent to me and someone who follows this is that it's becoming more and more, du jour. It's like one of those discussions that just won't go away. The Syria crisis, our esteemed climate scientist colleagues at Lamont have put, at least a part of a climate signature on what drove people out of Syria. It's not the whole story, just to be clear, but so, there are real issues that are, and I think Michael, maybe on the international law side, could also contribute a little bit more to this discussion. But it's not going to go away, and I think we're going to have to make greater efforts to address it.
Alex, can I just ask you a question? The numbers you came up with, were they based on a particular temperature assumption?
We had two scenarios. One was RCP 2.6, to use climate jargon, and the other was 8.5. And those are the low and the high emission scenarios. And we coupled them with socioeconomic scenarios that had also divergent paths in terms of demographic growth, urbanization trends, and things like that.
And would it be fair to say that the estimates were much different from the lower versus the higher emissions estimate?
Yeah, so the higher emissions definitely resulted in more people leaving areas.
Oh, thanks. Is this on? I can't tell. Okay. So I'm actually from South Florida and was wondering if you could speak a little about the shift in real estate development that's actually moved inland, and as other people probably know, is like displacing or is threatening to displace a lot of people. And so I'm wondering if you could, I only know sort of local politics, but addressing that in potentially other areas where there might be an opportunity to leverage, or for the government to leverage or incentivize, rebuilding or areas to migrate to from the real estate perspective or industry.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, in South Florida, does migrating inland help you in the long term? I mean, I'm just not sure how isn't a lot of it still vulnerable?
I think for a lot of South Florida, absolutely still vulnerable. Probably, in the extreme South Florida, vulnerable. All the way from current Gulf of Mexico to Atlantic, all the way inland. A little bit further north, the water might never actually inundate all those inland places, but you are going to have issues such as the higher water table, which makes it much, as sea levels rise, it's that much more challenging for our wastewater treatment plants, for example, which are largely gravity fed to function. So even just a small rainfall event, if that water table is higher, if the ocean is higher, it's that much harder to treat that water, get that water to drain. You're also thinking about water pollution issues, former gas stations, or even larger, sort of more polluted areas. A lot of that pollution may be making its way up to the surface. So I think, I'm sure there's some instance, but you'll also get some protection potentially from the immediate storm surge and hurricane if you make your way further inland. But if all your roads are along the coast, all your key infrastructure, temporary fix.
I think she's onto something, though. You could develop a nice little, promotional program saying safest place in America, least likely to be impacted by climate risks. Scientists say.
But yes, I mean, it's, that's a question we do get a lot. And I think just a point to sort of quickly highlight here, getting back to this point about greenhouse gas emissions, we as climate scientists can say, here's a part of the U.S. where temperatures are never going to get too high, we think, where there's strong capacity to adapt. But, fundamentally, the further we push the climate system, the further we increase greenhouse gases, turn up temperature, the bigger the potential for surprises, either in the climate system or across these societal systems. So it's, the vulnerability of the most vulnerable people around the world should be reason enough. But I think, even if we thought we could move to that place that would have an okay climate, you start to see so much displacement, so much suffering that it's going to cascade basically to everywhere. If you think about some of the conflict examples you mentioned. So,
And in parts of South Florida, the areas that did have some elevation were traditionally occupied by the lower income people because the people with the money wanted to live on the shore. But now that is flipping, and we're seeing displacement of some of the lower income people as the places with elevation become more desirable. So we have that kind of additional dislocation happening.
sounded like maybe there was a gentrification piece
Right.
to your question as well. So that's definitely something that has to be addressed. Next question. Let's see. Let's go back there. Just in front of you. Just that's fine. And then there, and then yeah.
I'm wondering about the actual purpose of when you are retreating from certain land, and particularly in places like New York City, where you're not just removing a vulnerable development, but are you also trying to then use that land to sort of be a protective barrier to what's behind it? And I'm wondering if there's any science yet in terms of how do you undevelop land that has been developed for, let's say, 100 years. And is there sort of any way that we know how that works, both on a case-by-case basis and or at scale?
Great question. Any thoughts?
Well, I know that in some areas, such as in Staten Island, where they were relocating from, they were taking great care to make sure nobody then built there. That would defeat the whole purpose, and trying to have it revert to a wetland area that could provide flood protection and so forth. So I don't know how far the science is along on that, but that concept is certainly there.
And the idea of green infrastructure and yeah, I mean, I'm not an engineer, but there's a lot of work being done in essentially understanding how to make your coastlines more resilient.
Thank you all very much. I do have a kind of an overhead question. Having heard all this and hearing a lot of it, what is your basis for optimism?
Well, I'm asked that a lot. The good news out there is that the price of renewable energy is plummeting, and solar and wind are becoming very economically competitive with coal and natural gas, and a lot of technological developments with storage and so forth. And so I think we're seeing a great boom in renewable energy, which is an absolutely central part of solving the emissions problem. And we're also seeing a very rapid growth of electric vehicles, although led by China. And I think that electrification of the world's passenger vehicle fleet is also a very important part of it. So on the clean energy technology side, I'm very optimistic.
Lisa, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of global optimism, but I can offer a few pieces of optimistic news from the American West when it comes to wildfire. I think we're seeing the power of disclosure in real estate and in insurance. Increasingly, if you want to buy a house in the mountains in the West, you will be informed about the fire danger in your area, and that's a relatively new development. So we are seeing market forces and disclosure in the market driving land use decisions and the way people behave on the land. Now, as I said, it doesn't mean they're less likely to buy that house, but they're much more likely to do what they need to do to reduce their risk, including removing fuels and creating other barriers to create what's called defensible space around the property. So I think there's some promising hope there. There's also a move that was encouraged by the federal government for communities that lived in high-risk zones to create community wildfire protection plans. And those include attention not only to which homes in the community are at highest risk, but where water supply exists, where ingress and egress routes exist for rescue. And so we are really seeing knowledge and understanding and readiness improve, I think, across the West. But I have to end my optimistic note on a pessimistic note, which is to say that the wildland-urban interface is currently only 16% developed, which is to say there's 84% of private land in that risky interface zone still open for sale.
I'll just say human resilience, because I think a lot of the climate migration issue anyway is going to be solved by individuals, not so much by top-down intervention.
Do you think that some form of natural migration might be led by large employers that have the foresight to move their facilities to safer ground?
You stumped the panel.
Amazon is building a new headquarters. We'll see where they go.
Yeah, and Colorado is courting them, and Colorado has a very high level of wildland-urban interface.
But to be fair, every place is courting them, so we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see what they do.
Question? Over here? Still? No, okay. I called it, just like, all right, let's go right there. Well, and then we'll go here.
I think part of the problem, as if there aren't enough in this issue, is that we can't even talk about the basic problem. When I poke my head in over the years at the Jersey Shore, this horrible word never comes up. And it almost never comes up even outside of the Jersey Shore on climate change conferences, although it's beginning to. Is there any thoughts about how to at least start and have the conversation with people in vulnerable areas in ways that they might actually listen? I mean, and it's part of that, part of it, not the whole thing, what would be too brutal. Part of it is just to lay out the basic scientific economic facts, after which you can get more human.
Well, there's certainly a lot of work being done on climate communication. Some of it is being done at the Earth Institute. There's an organization called CRED, the Center for Research and Environmental Decision Making, and a number of others that have psychologists, other people who are thinking about these issues of climate communication. It is not helped by the fact that there is a television network that is devoted to denying climate change and economics and everything else, and so there are a lot of impediments to it, but it's certainly an area where active research is being done.
Hi, I had a question about Manhattan specifically. We all know that the rising of the sea will happen. And so Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens, the coastal areas will be inundated with water, as we know, as we've seen happen during Hurricane Sandy. So it's the obvious of the infrastructure is going to collapse, specifically the subway. So even though Columbia University is on this grand mountain, which is wonderful, everyone will be moving up to the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. But in actuality, with the infrastructure collapsing, what is the reality of Manhattan?
Well, you're even gloomier than I am.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there are a number of efforts being done for soft infrastructure around Manhattan to try to preserve it. The subway system is paying a lot of attention to that. I mean, you're describing the book New York 2140, which is a very interesting novel that presents that. But I think there are major efforts to try to prevent that, but that sort of highlights the issue that this is one of the richest places on the planet, and we're struggling to come up with the infrastructure to prepare for it. There are many other places that have only a fraction of the resources, but much greater vulnerability.
I think, you know, we're stating the obvious, but part of the discussion when we do communicate on this topic needs to be around the public safety questions. You know, it's largely about assets and infrastructure, but there are a lot of parts of the world where, especially as the seas begin to rise, maybe also especially as ocean temperatures get a little warmer, where we're not going to be able to count on having 3 or 4 days to evacuate necessarily before a major storm. We may already be in that situation. So we haven't necessarily run all the scenarios for low-lying parts of North Carolina, South Florida, I'm sure numerous other parts of the world. It's not just about the lost real estate, but also real potential for people not being able to get out of harm's way, potentially in the face of this. Fire would be another example. I think our last question, I'd go here. So I hand up from
Thanks. I'm wondering if there's a way to design compensation for resettlement when the at-risk areas have really unclear monetary value, like informal settlements or cultural heritage sites.
So, in developing countries, you could do that. Like, Lagos is one case where you've got, extensive flood-prone areas in this deltaic environment. So it's one of the most at-risk regions of the world from a flood and, sea level rise perspective. This is in Nigeria. But you'd have to find a government that cares enough and, funds to do a relocation. And so it's the other element that we sometimes forget is that low-income populations want to live near where their jobs are and where their income source is. So we did some work in Sierra Leone, Sylvia Traska's here, and they live literally at water's edge, and during the high tide season, their houses are routinely flooded. So you'd think that would be a textbook case of saying this is enough, but they're fishermen and they need to live near where the fish are. The same way low-income populations need to live near where the jobs are, and to move them out to some outskirts somewhere and say you can take public transport for an hour and a half or 2 hours a day to get into the city is not really viable for them.
So I think that fantastic questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to take more, but I'm hoping that people can stick around over that bourbon. I'm not sure we're offering bourbon. What I see isn't quite as strong, but hopefully sufficient. But yeah, I hope we can continue this conversation. I'd like to thank everybody, and especially thank our panelists. It's great to